It started on a Saturday morning in late May, one of those perfect sunny days in Houston when the humidity hasn't quite set in yet. My husband, David, had just left for a work trip again. It was his third trip that month. I didn't even argue anymore. What was the point? He'd kissed me on the cheek, muttered something about needing to finalize a client deal, and left before I could say a word. As the front door slammed shut, the silence in the house was deafening. I was sipping my coffee when a car pulled into the driveway. My son Ethan's best friend, Ryan, stepped out. He had been around plenty of times before, but something about him that morning caught me off guard. He wasn't the lanky teenager I remembered from 2 years ago. At 22, he was broad-shouldered, with confidence that seemed out of place for someone his age. His smile was easy, disarming, and that day it was aimed directly at me. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," he called, walking toward the porch. His voice had that casual Texas drawl, the kind that made you feel both at ease and slightly nervous. "Morning, Ryan. You're early." I tried to keep my tone light, hiding the sudden flutter in my stomach. Ethan wanted to go grab some food before we hit the gym. Thought I'd swing by. Ethan was still upstairs, probably scrolling on his phone like most 20-year-olds. I told Ryan to come in, and he made himself comfortable in the kitchen while I busied myself with cleaning up the counter. He leaned against the island, watching me, and I felt the weight of his gaze. "You're always taking care of everyone, huh?" he said, his tone softer than usual. I laughed nervously, waving him off. "It's what moms do." But the way he looked at me made my pulse quicken. It wasn't inappropriate, not yet, but it lingered in that gray area between friendly and something else entirely. Before I could respond, Ethan bounded down the stairs, his voice breaking the spell. "Ryan. Dude, you're early. Let's go." They left, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my mind racing. That evening, when Ethan texted to say he'd be staying over at Ryan's place, I found myself scrolling through Instagram out of boredom. I didn't mean to look him up. It just happened. His profile was full of candid shots. Him at the beach, lifting weights, laughing with friends. I caught myself staring at one photo a little too long, then slammed my phone down, disgusted with myself. What was I doing? The next day, Ryan showed up again, this time alone. Ethan was at a study group, and Ryan had come to borrow some tools from the garage. "Ethan said you needed help fixing the cabinet in the laundry room," he explained. I froze. Did he now? "Yeah, I've got time," he said, his easy smile returning. "Unless you've got it under control." I didn't, of course, so I led him to the laundry room. He worked quietly, the air between us heavy with unspoken tension. Every now and then, he'd ask me to hand him a wrench or hold a piece of wood in place. At one point, our hands brushed, and I pulled mine back quickly, pretending it hadn't happened. "You're nervous," he said, his tone teasing but not unkind. "I'm fine," I shot back, but my voice betrayed me. When he finished, he stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans. "There you go, Mrs. Carter. Good as new." I thanked him, and for a moment, I thought he'd leave. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know," he said, his voice low. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" He took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "I mean, you deserve to have someone who notices you, who sees you for everything you are." I froze, caught between the overwhelming guilt and the undeniable pull of his words. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang, shattering the moment like glass hitting the floor. I hurried to answer it, my hands trembling. It was a delivery driver, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. By the time I returned, Ryan was gone, the tension he left behind filling the empty room. That night, as I lay in bed beside David, who was snoring softly, I couldn't stop replaying the day in my mind. The way Ryan had looked at me, the way he'd spoken, it wasn't just in my head. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long it scared me. I felt alive. The days that followed felt like I was balancing on a razor's edge. I tried to convince myself that Ryan's words had been innocent, that I'd misread the situation. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way he had looked at me, his voice echoing in my mind. By Wednesday, Ethan invited Ryan over again. They were in the backyard tossing a football, their laughter carrying through the open window as I prepared snacks in the kitchen. The scene was perfectly normal, yet I couldn't shake the unease bubbling under the surface. When I glanced outside, Ryan caught my eye. He flashed a quick smile, just a simple gesture, but it lingered a beat too long. I looked away, hoping no one noticed the way my hands trembled. Then came Thursday. Ethan had an evening class, and David, predictably, was working late again. I settled onto the couch with a glass of wine and a book, trying to unwind, when the doorbell rang. Opening the door, I found Ryan standing there, holding a toolbox. "Ethan said the garage door's been acting up," he said casually. I blinked, thrown off. Yeah. It sticks sometimes." "Thought I'd take a look," he said, stepping inside before I could process what was happening. In the garage, Ryan crouched by the door mechanism, his movements deliberate. I stayed a few feet away, arms crossed, pretending to scroll through my phone. "You don't have to hover," he said with a smirk, glancing over his shoulder. "I'm not hovering," I shot back, but I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a rag and stood, his height suddenly overwhelming in the small space. "Fixed it," he said. "Should be good as new." I thanked him, hoping he'd leave quickly, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, his eyes scanning my face like he was trying to read something unspoken. "You seem distracted lately," he said, his voice soft but deliberate. My stomach flipped. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," he replied, stepping closer. His tone wasn't teasing anymore. It was serious, almost challenging. I backed up, my shoulder brushing against the cold metal of the doorframe. "Ryan, whatever this is, it needs to stop." "What am I doing, Mrs. Carter?" His voice dropped, and he took another step closer, closing the space between us. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "You know exactly what you're doing." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He was so close now I could feel the heat radiating off him, and my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Tell me to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the easiest thing in the world to say, and yet I couldn't force the words out. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as he reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from my face. His hand lingered for a moment, and I felt something inside me unravel. It wasn't just attraction. It was the way he made me feel seen, as if all the years of being invisible in my own home had suddenly fallen away. "You should go," I finally whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. He searched my face, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you really want?" The answer should have been yes. It had to be yes. But the silence between us told a different story. Before I could respond, the sharp sound of Ethan's car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. I stepped back quickly, my heart hammering in my chest as Ryan straightened and ran a hand through his hair. "Guess I'll see you around," he said, his tone easy again, as if nothing had happened. I didn't respond, too busy trying to calm the storm raging inside me. That night, I barely slept. As David snored beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything that had happened. How had I let it get this far? And why couldn't I stop it? The worst part was the realization I'd been trying to avoid. I didn't want to stop. By the weekend, the tension in the air was so thick I could practically feel it pressing down on me. Ethan was out with friends, David was working another late shift, and I was alone again. The silence of the house gnawed at me, amplifying every stray thought. When the doorbell rang that evening, my stomach flipped. I didn't need to check to know who it was. Sure enough, Ryan stood on the porch, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. He wasn't smiling this time. His usual ease was replaced with something heavier, something I couldn't quite name. "I shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low. "Then why are you here?" I asked, even though I already knew. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, we just stood there, the unspoken weight of everything between us filling the space. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his words like a lightning strike in the quiet night. My breath caught, and I looked away, gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white. "This isn't right, Ryan," I whispered. "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But that doesn't make it any less real." I stepped aside, letting him in against every rational thought screaming at me to shut the door. We ended up in the living room, where the dim light from the lamp cast long shadows across the walls. I sat on the edge of the couch, my arms folded tightly across my chest, while he paced in front of me. "This is wrong," I said, more to myself than to him. "Then why does it feel like the only thing that makes sense?" he countered, stopping to face me. I didn't have an answer, because he wasn't wrong. For the first time in years, I felt awake, alive, even, and that terrified me. "You have to leave," I said finally, standing up and moving toward the door. But before I could take another step, he grabbed my wrist, his touch sending a jolt through me. "Do you want me to go?" My body betrayed me, freezing in place. I couldn't answer, and the silence between us was deafening. Slowly, he let go, his hand falling to his side, and the look in his eyes was devastating. "I'll leave if that's what you want," he said quietly. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I opened my mouth to say yes, to end it right then and there, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I closed my eyes, and when I felt him step closer, I didn't stop him. His hand cupped my face, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as if he was testing my resolve. But when I didn't pull away, it deepened, and every rational thought I had left crumbled into ash. For the first time in years, I felt wanted, needed, alive. We pulled apart abruptly when headlights swept across the window. My heart dropped into my stomach as I realized it was David's car pulling into the driveway. "Go," I hissed, shoving Ryan toward the back door. He didn't argue, slipping out into the night without a sound. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, before grabbing a book from the coffee table and collapsing onto the couch just as the front door opened. David walked in, looking exhausted as usual. He barely glanced at me, muttering a half-hearted greeting before heading to the kitchen to grab a beer. I watched him disappear down the hallway, my heart still racing from what had just happened. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the kiss in my mind. The way Ryan had looked at me, the way his touch had made me feel like the most important person in the world. It was intoxicating and terrifying. I knew I was playing with fire, and sooner or later, I was going to get burned. But the truth was, I didn't care. Not yet. By Monday, the memory of that kiss had burned itself into my mind. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen again, that I'd pull myself together, but the truth was I didn't want to. That was the part one hated the most, how much I wanted it. Ethan and Ryan spent the afternoon in the backyard again, playing basketball under the blistering Texas sun. I kept myself busy in the kitchen, scrubbing counters that were already spotless. Every now and then, I glanced out the window, watching Ryan move with a confidence that made my chest tighten. At one point, Ethan came inside to grab a drink, leaving Ryan alone. That's when he looked up at the window, catching me watching. Instead of looking away, he smirked, a knowing gleam in his eyes. My stomach flipped, and I quickly turned back to the sink. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, or so I thought. But later that evening, when Ethan left to meet friends, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Ryan standing there, his shirt damp with sweat and his hair tousled from the game. "You forgot this," he said, holding up a water bottle Ethan had left behind. "Thanks," I said, reaching for it. But he didn't hand it over. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Ryan, why are you pretending this didn't happen?" he interrupted, his voice low and steady. "Because it didn't," I snapped, backing away. His expression softened, and he took a step closer. "You don't believe that?" "Ryan, this is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "You're Ethan's friend, my son's friend. And you're not happy," he shot back. "Don't tell me you are. I see it every time I walk in this house." I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Because he was right. I wasn't happy, hadn't been in years. Before I could stop him, he closed the space between us, his hand brushing mine. "Just tell me to leave," he said softly. "Say the word and I'll go." But I couldn't say it. Instead, I found myself closing my eyes as his lips found mine again. This kiss was different. Hungrier, more desperate. My hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer even as every rational part of me screamed to stop. We stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the coat rack, and the sound snapped me back to reality. I pushed him away, my chest heaving. This has to stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded, stepping back. "If that's what you want," he said quietly. "It is," I lied. The rest of the week was unbearable. Every time Ryan came over, I avoided him as much as possible, refusing to be alone in the same room. Ethan didn't seem to notice the tension, too wrapped up in his own world to pay attention to mine. But Ryan noticed. I caught him watching me from across the room, his gaze lingering a second too long. Then Friday came. Ethan had gone to a friend's house for the night, and David was still at work. I was folding laundry in the living room when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Ryan standing there, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my heart pounding. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally. "Do what?" "Pretend that I don't care about you," he admitted, his voice raw. "That I don't think about you every second of the day." His words hit me like a freight train. "Ryan, you can't say things like that." "Why not?" he demanded, stepping closer. "Because it's true? Because you feel the same way." I froze, unable to deny it. "You do," he said, his voice softer now. "I can see it in your eyes." The air between us crackled with tension, and I felt my resolve crumbling. "This isn't fair," I whispered. "Fair," he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Fair has nothing to do with this." Before I could stop him, he closed the space between us, his hands on my waist. And just like that, I let the last of my defenses fall. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped us apart. My stomach dropped as I realized it was David. Ryan's eyes widened, and without a word, he slipped out the back door. I barely had time to compose myself before David walked in, his usual tired expression giving no indication that he suspected anything. "Long day," he muttered, grabbing a beer from the fridge. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaky. But inside, I was falling apart. Because no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep this secret much longer. The following days felt like a countdown to disaster. Every time David walked into the room, my stomach tightened, and I avoided his eyes. I couldn't help but feel like he knew something, even though he never gave any indication. But it wasn't David I feared most, it was Ethan. Ryan still came around, laughing and joking with Ethan as if nothing had happened. I envied his composure. Meanwhile, I was unraveling at the seams. Wednesday night, Ethan invited Ryan to stay for dinner. The three of us sat around the table, making small talk while David was stuck at the office late again. I avoided looking at Ryan, but I could feel his eyes on me, each glance like a spark threatening to ignite everything. Ethan, oblivious as always, kept the conversation going. "So, Ryan, you're still seeing that girl from the gym?" he asked between bites of pizza. I froze, my fork hovering midair. Ryan didn't miss a beat. Nah, that didn't work out. Man, you're too picky, Ethan teased, laughing. She was hot. Ryan smirked but didn't respond. His gaze flicked to me for the briefest second, and my heart slammed against my ribs. I excused myself to grab another drink, desperate for an escape. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles turned white. My breath came in shallow bursts as I tried to calm the storm inside me. Need some help? I jumped at the sound of Ryan's voice. He was leaning against the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. I'm fine, I said quickly, turning my back to him. But he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You don't look fine. Ryan, not here, I hissed, glancing toward the dining room. He ignored me, stepping so close I could feel the heat radiating from him. You've been avoiding me, he said, his tone almost accusatory. Because this needs to stop, I whispered, my voice trembling. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine as I gripped the counter. Do you really want it to stop? Before I could answer, Ethan's voice rang out from the dining room. Mom? Ryan? You guys good in there? I jerked my hand away, stepping back from Ryan so fast, I nearly knocked over a glass. Yeah, Ethan. Just grabbing drinks, I called out, my voice strained. Ryan gave me one last lingering look before turning and heading back to the table, as if nothing had happened. I followed a moment later, my hands shaking as I set the drinks down. Ethan didn't seem to notice, too busy scrolling through his phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to give. The next day, it did. David had left for an overnight work trip, and Ethan was at a study group. The house was quiet, too quiet, when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Ryan standing there, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, he said, stepping inside before I could respond. Ryan, this isn't a good time. I began, but he cut me off. When is it ever a good time? He snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I closed the door, turning to face him. What do you want me to say, Ryan? That this was a mistake? Because it was. A mistake. He took a step closer, his jaw tight. That's not what it felt like. I swallowed hard, my back pressing against the wall. You don't understand. No, you don't understand, he interrupted, his voice rising. Do you think I planned this? That I wanted to feel this way about you? The raw emotion in his voice hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him to leave, to end it once and for all, but the words wouldn't come. Ryan, this has to stop, I said finally, though even I didn't believe it. He stepped even closer, his eyes locking onto mine. Then tell me to leave. Look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel the same way. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I can't, I whispered. At that moment, the sound of Ethan's car pulling into the driveway shattered the air like glass. My heart leaped into my throat. You need to go, I hissed, pushing him toward the back door. Ryan hesitated, his expression conflicted. This isn't over, he said quietly before slipping out into the night. I barely had time to compose myself before Ethan walked in, tossing his backpack onto the couch. Hey, Mom, he said, heading for the fridge. Hey, I replied, my voice shaky. He paused, his brow furrowing. You okay? You look off. I've fine, Elid, forcing a smile. But as he turned away, I felt the weight of my actions crashing down on me. I was living on borrowed time, and I knew it. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Ethan started asking more questions, casual at first, but with an edge that made my stomach twist. You've been acting weird lately, Mom, he said one evening as we sat at the table. David was still at work, as usual. I'm fine, I replied too quickly, forcing a smile. You sure? He pressed, his eyes narrowing. I'm just tired, I said, avoiding his gaze. Ethan shrugged, but I could feel his suspicion growing. I knew I was running out of time. That Friday evening, The tension finally snapped. Ethan had gone out with friends, and David was still working late. I was alone again, or so I thought. The knock at the back door startled me. When I opened it, Ryan stood there, his face set with determination. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my heart racing. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside before I could stop him. "Ryan, you can't keep showing up like this," I hissed, glancing nervously toward the front of the house. "I don't care," he said, his voice firm. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." I closed my eyes, leaning against the counter. "This is dangerous," I whispered. "We've already gone too far." "Then why can't you let it go?" he challenged, stepping closer. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway froze us both. I peeked through the window and felt my blood run cold. It wasn't David, it was Ethan. "You have to leave," I said urgently, grabbing Ryan's arm. But he didn't move. "No," he said, his voice low. "I'm done running." My heart pounded as I heard Ethan's keys jingling in the lock. "Ryan, please," I begged, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated for a moment before finally heading toward the back door. But he was too late. Ethan stepped inside just as Ryan was halfway out. The silence was deafening. Ethan's eyes darted between us, his expression shifting from confusion to something much darker. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Nothing," I said quickly, my hands trembling. "Doesn't look like nothing," Ethan shot back, his gaze locking onto Ryan. "I was just leaving," Ryan said, his voice steady but strained. Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Leaving from where?" "My mom's house." "What are you doing here?" "Ethan, calm down," I said, trying to defuse the situation. "Don't tell me to calm down," he snapped, his voice cracking with anger. "What's going on, Mom? Why is he here?" I couldn't answer. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. "Ethan," Ryan began, but Ethan cut him off. "No," he said, his voice cold. "You don't get to talk. Get out. Now." Ryan glanced at me, his eyes searching mine for some kind of reassurance. But I couldn't give him any. He nodded once before slipping out the door, leaving me alone to face my son. Ethan turned to me, his face a storm of betrayal and disbelief. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. "Is this why you've been acting so weird?" he demanded. Is there something going on between you and Ryan?" The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to lie, to tell him he was wrong, but the look on his face stopped me. "Ethan," I began, my voice trembling. He shook his head, stepping back as if the distance could protect him from the truth. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You've got to be kidding me." "Please let me explain," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Explain what?" he yelled. "That you've been sneaking around with my best friend? How do you even begin to explain something like that?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said weakly. "But it did," he snapped. "And now what? What am I supposed to do with this?" The room was spinning, and I felt like I was about to collapse under the weight of everything. "Ethan, Don't," he said, his voice hollow. "I can't even look at you right now." He turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind replaying the scene over and over. The truth was out, and the fragile balance I'd been trying to maintain had crumbled into dust. When David came home later that night, I couldn't bring myself to tell him. I sat in silence as he talked about his day, oblivious to the wreckage I had caused. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The house felt like a tomb. Ethan hadn't come home since he stormed out 2 nights ago. He ignored my texts, sent my calls to voicemail, and when I'd driven by Ryan's place hoping to find him there, his car wasn't in the driveway. The silence was suffocating, filling every corner of the house. David was starting to notice. "You've been jumpy all week," he said over breakfast. What's going on with you? Nothing, I lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. His brow furrowed, but he didn't press. He was already running late for work and left with a distracted kiss on the top of my head. The second the door shut, my composure crumbled. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched coffee, replaying every terrible decision that had led me to this moment. I should have told Ryan to stay away from the start. I should have stopped it before it began. I should have been stronger. But I hadn't. And now my son hated me. Ryan was gone, and my marriage was teetering on the edge of destruction. By the afternoon, Ethan still hadn't responded. The guilt gnawed at me until I couldn't take it anymore. I called him again, holding my breath as the line rang. To my shock, he picked up. What do you want? His voice was cold, distant. Ethan, please, I said, my voice cracking. Can we just talk? There's nothing to talk about, he snapped. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Sorry doesn't fix this, Mom, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. You didn't just screw up. You destroyed everything. You and Ryan. How could you? I don't know, I admitted, my voice shaking. I was lonely, and I made a mistake. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. Yeah, you did, he said. And now I don't even know who you are anymore. The line went dead before I could say another word. I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, the walls closing in on me. I wanted to fix it, to undo everything, but there was no way to erase what I'd done. When David came home that evening, I was sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. You okay? He asked, his voice wary. I'm fine, I muttered, barely looking at him. He sat down beside me, resting a hand on my shoulder. You don't seem fine. I said I'm fine, I snapped, shrugging him off. David pulled back, his expression shifting to something darker. What's going on, Mary? The way he looked at me made my stomach twist. He wasn't just suspicious, he was piecing things together. I'm just stressed, I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. But David wasn't buying it. Where's Ethan? Why hasn't he been home? My throat tightened, and I felt the panic rising. He's with friends. I lied, my voice barely steady. David's eyes narrowed. What's really going on here? Because something's not right, and you're not telling me. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. I froze, my heart pounding as David stood to answer it. The moment he opened the door, my worst fear stepped into the room. Ryan. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but his presence was enough to make the world tilt on its axis. Ryan, David said, his voice full of confusion. What are you doing here? Ryan's eyes flicked to me, and in that instant I knew. He wasn't here to stay silent anymore. I need to talk to you, Ryan said, his voice quiet but firm. David turned to look at me, suspicion flashing across his face. Mary? What's this about? I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My body felt frozen, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Ryan, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Don't. But it was too late.